question about the Ecuador economy here?
Well, this is part of the process, the destructive process of the global crisis of overproduction. Capitalism has entered into a very rapid process of decomposition in terms of the basic mechanisms of recovering coherence in terms of international trade, international finance system, and the international monetary system. Ecuador was one of the experiments in terms of the consolidation of the dollar as the monopoly of transactionality and debt and liquidity at the global level in the post-Cold War era. And it shows earlier than other countries in the same circumstances the limitations and the internal contradictions of the type of sovereignty mutilation that dollarization suppose in terms of the disadvantage vis-a-vis the rest of the economies. The volatility and the hostility of the international markets due to the internal processes of the crisis had led to a much more polarized world, and in the case of Ecuador, we had suffered the transformation of the dynamics, the cycle of the dynamics of commodity demands at the global level, basically led by China, and the dynamics that China push over the rest of the economies linked to the very rapid transition that the Chinese industry had deployed during the last 10-15 years. Oil is one of those derived demands, and the fact that the geographical new attractor is in China and the economy is linked to China's deployment of and high rates of growth is in a very blatant contradiction with the control of oil prices to the big transnationals. The inheritance of the Seven Sisters today are still in control of the whole energy industry, and Ecuador had to suffer the manipulation of those prices. Since 2014 especially, that had provoked a significant contraction in terms of the fiscal revenues, but also in terms of the provision of devices to the economy. And opposite to what happened to other small, open and dependent economies, on top of all the problems that the fluctuations in the international markets provoke to the domestic economy, we have an additional problem linked to the lack of liquidity. In other countries, you have to pay with the hard currencies the dues of the balance of payments, and you remain with the circulation of the domestic currency. In the Ecuadorian case, on top, I insist, of all the other structural problems, you have an immediately very dominant in the short run effect due to the fact that physically the hard currency abandoned the country, and we haven't been able to deploy alternative mechanisms of liquidity and transactionality in the domestic channels of production and distribution. Due to the inheritance, the structural inheritance of pyramidal situation that is fractally reproduced in terms of the relationship between the rural areas and the urban cities, between the capitalist sector and the rest of the economy. That asymmetric situation also provoked an asymmetrical circulation of cash, and the troubles that could trigger could lead to a solvency crisis, even in those sectors in which we don't have the structural restraint in terms of the access to productive assets. So we have a confluence, a convergence of those phenomena in the framework of a significant challenge that the Ecuadorian society, the country, had launched against the established powers, and those are unforgivable. The fact that Ecuador had led a very thorough international audit of the external debt that ended into a historical exercise in terms of debt cancellation through very creative mechanisms had triggered the preparation of retaliations, a kind of a punishment for this type of daring behavior of a small country like Ecuador. The fact that Ecuador expelled the military base in Manta in 2009 is also triggering the revenge of the empire that had to endure such an insolent stance on behalf of such a tiny country like Ecuador. The fact that Ecuador played a very principal role in the international discussion about an alternative financial architecture, challenging the monopolistic role of the dollar in terms of transactionality, liquidity, and debt, and had deployed both at the academic level and the decision-making circles, but also at the grassroots organizations, the promotion of a debate about the alternatives ways to organize the economy, to organize finance, to organize the markets, to organize liquidity, to organize credit, had also triggered the desire of retaliation on behalf of the oligarchic and imperialist powers that are taking advantage of this new wave of conservative restoration in order to deploy very harsh ideological and psychological operative in order to dismantle all the social conquest that had been built in a very shy manner in Ecuador in the framework of the whole process in Latin America. The lack of social mobilization during these progressive years had limited the scope of the reforms, and we haven't been able to introduce a very needed, very crucial and deep structural reforms that could support the transition towards an alternative, a much more consolidated, much more stable alternative regime of accumulation. The combination, the mix between new institutions and heterodox and progressive economic policies had been limited precisely by the external cycle, by the evolution of the international markets, with this plus of effects due to the structural restrictions of dollarization. Right now, upon the inadmissible evidences of corruption, some excesses in terms of the use of the public funds, both in terms of public expenditure and also in terms of public investment. We need to be very careful with respect to the pretext of these type of situations that are still punctual, that are limited in terms of the scope and the degree of damage of the economy, vis-a-vis the significant transformation in the economic dynamics. For the first time in 25 years, we have a sustained increase in the average income of the population. Just in 2004, after 25 years of neoliberal policies, we reached the level of per capita GDP of 1981. And it is only the trend that was deployed by the new combination of policies, of progressive policies, that we have a sustained increase in the average income of the population, but also with accompanied for the first time of a huge effort in terms of income distribution and a huge effort in terms of the construction of infrastructure and development of the productive forces. For the first time, we have 10 years in which every decile, every 10% of the population had increased, had improved the purchasing power, opposite to what happened in the 30 previous years of neoliberalism, in which it was only the richest 10%, and not even that, but the 1%, the richest 1% of the population, in which you have statistics of an improvement of the situation at the cost of the deterioration of the conditions of life of the whole population. So beyond any type of deserved criticisms, and with the scientific filtering of a lot of opportunist reactions that are creating the conditions for this conservative restoration, what we need to do is to deepen the structural reforms in favor of a sustained orientation of the economy in favor of the more vulnerable segments of the population, in favor of an alternative horizon of life in the perspective of what was very rightly defined as the summa causae. That means to live in excellency, to transform the mode of life of the population beyond the dictatorship of capital, and to put the human being and the human values as the director principle of the organization of the economy, of the organization of the society, in very clear contrast with the neoliberal principles, in very clear contrast with this theology of money as the unique religion in the state. So the alternative for the Ecuadorian people and the Latin American people is to return to the path of revolutionary transformations, but this time with the courage and the daring to go to the crucial, the systemically significant mechanisms that could assure the resilience and the sustainability of the endogenous conditions that could foster further transformations in favor of the people. That requires organization, conscience of the grassroots organizations in the whole Latin America, Otherwise, as a continent, because those are the conditions of globalization, the whole continent is going to be victim of a programmed and long-term crisis that could reproduce the type of societal destruction that the world experienced in the fate of the African peoples, of the African countries after independence, especially after the effects of the programmed crisis of the external debt during the 80s, the 90s, and the current part of the 21st century. So this Africanization of Latin America is going to be one of the strategic results of a very delicate program of psychological, ideological, financial, commercial, and even military operations upon our continent in order to improve the conditions of profitability in the Anglo-American axis, and more specifically linked to the speculative and rent-seeking activities that had characterized the outcome of the crisis from the perspective and from the interest of this very narrow speculative oligarchy.